Before these words pass fully into the chronicle, pause for a moment and listen as those before you once did. By firelight, by candle, by the quiet hum of the world itself. If you wish, leave a mark of your presence by sharing the city from which you listen, and join those who return to these forbidden histories, so the record is not forgotten. What follows is not legend shaped by fancy, but memory shaped by survival. Long before Faerun had a name, before Toril knew sky or soil, reality existed in a state that modern sages struggle to describe without contradiction. Creation had structure, but no permanence. Power existed, but not yet purpose. From this early state arose two forces that would come to define existence itself: the gods, embodiments of ordered creation, and the primordials, living manifestations of raw elemental chaos. In the earliest ages recorded in divine memory, these beings did not immediately clash. The primordials shaped matter instinctively, driven by elemental impulse rather than intent. Fire burned because it was fire. Earth crushed because it was earth. Storms raged without malice, and oceans consumed without hunger. The gods, newly awakened to self-awareness and design, did not at first seek dominion. They observed, they learned, and in time, they began to shape. This act, shaping, was the first fracture. Where a primordial raised mountains by convulsion, a god raised them by design. Where seas once wandered freely, gods gave them borders. Time, once a drifting concept, began to flow with direction. Cause followed effect. Memory gained meaning. These changes were not subtle. Reality itself began to favor order, stability, and continuity. To the gods, this was creation refined. To the primordials, it was violation. Among the earliest divine beings were those who would later be known as Selûne and Shar, twins born from the same cosmic moment, representing light and darkness, revelation and loss. Even at this stage, their existence demonstrated a key truth of divinity. Opposition could coexist within a single framework. The primordials did not share this philosophy. To them, opposition meant annihilation or dominance, never balance. As gods continued their work, the primordials reacted not with negotiation, but with instinctive resistance. Earth rebelled against imposed shape. Fire sought to consume crafted forms. The seas attempted to reclaim the land. Storms intensified, not out of strategy, but out of elemental outrage. These were not yet battles. There were no armies, no banners, no lines drawn. But the universe began to tremble. Toril, still unformed, existed as a convergence point. Its raw potential made it attractive to both sides. The primordials were drawn to its deep elemental richness. The gods saw in it a canvas upon which ordered existence could finally endure. This mutual interest ensured that Toril would not remain untouched for long. The gods began anchoring their influence, binding concepts such as gravity, mortality, and continuity more firmly to the world. Each binding reduced the freedom of elemental chaos. Each law written into reality weakened the primordials' dominion, not by force, but by permanence. This was a form of power the primordials had never wielded. Some primordials adapted, others resisted blindly. A few began to understand that the gods were not merely rivals, but an existential threat. The first true confrontations followed. When divine power met elemental force directly, the results were catastrophic. Entire regions of Proto-Toril were erased, their substance scattered across plains. What would later become the elemental chaos bled into the astral sea. Boundaries between realms thinned, not by accident, but by strain. Reality began to tear along the fault lines of its own becoming. At this stage, neither side fully understood the cost. The gods believed order would eventually prevail through endurance. The primordials believed chaos would reassert itself through inevitability. Both assumptions were flawed. A crucial shift occurred when the gods realized that shaping the world was not enough. They would have to defend it. Purpose demanded commitment. Creation demanded protection. From this realization emerged the earliest alliances among the gods, not yet formal pantheons, but shared resolve. This was the moment when conflict became war. The primordials responded in kind, not by unity, but by escalation. Their attacks grew more focused. Elemental titans formed from raw substance, wielding continents as weapons. Volcanoes were turned into siege engines. Oceans were hurled against the land in deliberate annihilation. The world itself became the battlefield, and Toril began to suffer wounds that would never fully heal. These scars were not merely physical, they were metaphysical. Laws of magic bent under pressure. Time stuttered, space folded. Cause and effect occasionally failed, replaced by raw elemental assertion. Even the gods, beings of immense power, were forced to adapt or perish. By the end of this early phase, one truth had become unavoidable. Coexistence was no longer possible. Reality could not support both absolute order and absolute chaos. One would have to yield or be broken. The Dawn War had truly begun, and from this point onward, nothing that would come to be called Faerun would ever be untouched by it. Once war became unavoidable, the nature of divinity itself began to change. The gods were no longer distant shapers working through abstraction and patience. They were now participants in a struggle that demanded presence, choice, and sacrifice. In defending creation, they discovered that power alone was insufficient without coordination, identity, and defined purpose. It was during this phase that divine roles first began to solidify. Deities who had once existed as broad cosmic principles started to express narrower dominions, not by decree, but by necessity. Knowledge became a weapon. Magic became a tool of resistance. Storms were answered not with opposing storms, but with counterlaws that limited their reach. Every god who engaged the conflict found themselves shaped by it. This was not yet the age of names and temples, but it was the age of function. Some gods gravitated toward direct confrontation. Others worked subtly, reinforcing the underlying structure of reality so that it could survive repeated assault. Maestra, whose essence was inseparable from magic itself, became crucial not because she struck the hardest blows, but because she ensured that spellcraft, arcane stability, and metaphysical consistency did not collapse under elemental pressure. Without this anchoring, divine action would have unraveled into chaos indistinguishable from that of the primordials. The primordials, by contrast, did not evolve in roles. They intensified in expression. Each embodied its element more completely, shedding restraint in favor of magnitude. Earth primordials deepened the world's crust, collapsing entire regions into molten depths. Fire primordials ignited the firmament itself, turning skies into infernos. Water primordials erased coastlines repeatedly, refusing to allow any boundary to endure. At the center of these clashes, Toril began to acquire form through damage. What later generations would call mountains were often the remains of divine barriers forced upward under unimaginable stress. What would become deep oceans were scars where the world had failed to resist, filling with the remnants of displaced matter and magic. Even gravity itself fluctuated in places, evidence of laws imposed and broken in rapid succession. A significant development occurred when the gods recognized that the primordials could not be reasoned with because they did not perceive time as continuity. To an elemental being, destruction carried no memory, and repetition carried no cost. The gods, however, remembered. They planned. And this asymmetry became a decisive factor. Divine alliances began to form more deliberately. Selûne's light served not only as illumination, but as orientation, an anchor against the disorienting vastness of chaos. Chantea's emerging connection to growth and endurance reinforced the idea that life itself could be a stabilizing force. These gods did not merely fight. They asserted permanence in a universe that resisted it. The primordials responded with a strategy that was less organized, but devastating in scale. They sought to unmake what the gods were trying to preserve by overwhelming it completely. Rather than dismantling laws one by one, they attempted to erase the conditions under which laws could exist at all. Entire regions of Toril were temporarily reduced to raw potential, neither land, nor sea, nor sky. It was during these assaults that the first proto-life forms appeared and vanished in rapid succession. They were not yet mortals as later ages would define them, but experimental consequences of divine order intersecting with elemental force. Most could not endure. A few persisted long enough to influence later creation, their forms echoing faintly in the dragons and giants that would follow. A pivotal realization emerged among the gods. The war could not be won solely by resisting destruction. As long as the primordials remained unbound, they could always return. Chaos did not need victory, it only needed time. This understanding marked a subtle but profound shift in divine strategy. The objective was no longer to repel the primordials endlessly, but to limit them permanently. Binding, imprisonment, and separation became viable goals. The gods began experimenting with constraints that could hold beings older than structure itself. These early attempts were imperfect. Some bindings failed catastrophically, tearing holes between planes. Others succeeded only briefly, collapsing under sustained elemental pressure. But each failure taught the gods more about the nature of their enemies and about the limits of their own power. By the end of this stage of the conflict, the war had acquired a new character. It was no longer a chaotic collision of forces, but a contest between endurance and inevitability. The gods had accepted that victory would not come quickly, or cleanly, or without cost. What had once been a dispute over creation had become a struggle over whether reality could be made to last at all. And in that understanding, the fate of Toril shifted from incidental battlefield to essential prize. As the war dragged onward, Toril ceased to be merely a site of conflict and became its proving ground. The world absorbed the weight of repeated divine and primordial clashes, and in doing so, it began to develop traits that were neither purely ordered nor wholly chaotic. This transformation was not intentional. It was consequence made permanent. By this stage, the gods understood that every confrontation reshaped the battlefield itself. Victory could not be measured solely by the defeat of an enemy, but by whether the world endured afterward. Entire strategies were abandoned when their success left behind regions too unstable to sustain reality. Preservation, once secondary, became inseparable from triumph. It was during this period that the distinction between planes grew sharper. The astral sea and the elemental chaos, once loosely defined states of existence, were forced into clearer separation by the strain of war. Each time a primordial was driven back, its essence recoiled toward the elemental chaos. Each time a god asserted control, divine presence reinforced the astral realms. These movements were not decrees, they were reactions, like pressure shaping stone. The primordials began to exploit this emerging structure in ways that surprised the gods. By retreating into the elemental chaos, they could strike indirectly, sending surges of raw power through weakened points in Taril's fabric. Earthquakes, superstorms, and planar breaches became tools of attrition rather than random byproducts. Chaos learned not in strategy, but in opportunity. In response, the gods deepened their cooperation. This was the era in which pantheonic identity truly emerged, not as hierarchy imposed from above, but as interdependence forged under threat. Deities learned which of their powers complemented others, and which created dangerous overlap. Conflict among gods did not vanish, but it was restrained by necessity. A defining example of this cooperation was the increasing reliance on divine champions and crafted beings. The gods began to shape servants capable of operating within Taril without tearing it apart by their presence. These were not mortals in the later sense, but powerful entities bound by divine intent and limited in scope. They acted as stabilizers, anchoring regions long enough for reality to recover. From this practice arose the ancestors of dragons and giants. Dragons emerged as embodiments of elemental power tempered by will and memory. Giants reflected the gods' attempt to create beings that could confront primordial forces directly while remaining bound to the world's laws. Both would later turn against each other in ages yet to come. But their origin lay in a single necessity: intermediaries between God and world. This creation carried unintended consequences. By granting such beings agency and longevity, the gods introduced new variables into a system already under strain. Dragons remembered the war. Giants inherited its grudges. The seeds of future conflicts were sown even as the present one raged on. A crucial moment came when several gods attempted a coordinated binding of a major primordial force. The effort succeeded only partially. The primordial was neither destroyed nor fully imprisoned, but fractured, its essence scattered across deep layers of Taril and the elemental chaos. This act stabilized the immediate region, but created a persistent source of elemental turbulence that would endure into later ages. This event altered divine expectations. It demonstrated that absolute solutions were not always possible. Containment could replace annihilation. Imperfect victories could still reshape the future. The primordials responded with their most devastating escalation yet. No longer content to attack isolated regions, they began targeting the mechanisms of divine cooperation themselves. Where gods had bound their powers together, primordials struck at the seams, forcing deities to choose between saving the world and saving one another. Several divine alliances fractured under this pressure. Old rivalries resurfaced. Differing visions of what reality should become re-emerged, now sharpened by exhaustion and fear. The war was no longer fought only between gods and primordials, but within the divine coalition itself. Yet even in this fragmentation, a deeper unity formed. The gods began to accept limits, not merely on their power, but on their authority. The realization grew that unchecked divinity could damage reality almost as severely as unchecked chaos. This understanding would later shape cosmic law in ways few could yet imagine. By the close of this phase, Toril was no longer a blank world struggling to exist. It was a wounded one, layered with memory, structure, and latent instability. The war had etched itself into the planet's bones. What remained uncertain was whether those bones would hold or shatter under what was yet to come. By the time the conflict reached its next phase, the Dawn War had stripped away every illusion of simplicity. Neither side could claim moral clarity, and neither could deny responsibility for the damage already inflicted. Tyrell endured not because it was strong, but because it had become necessary. Too much power, too much memory, and too many consequences were now bound to its existence to allow its destruction without unraveling far more. It was in this stage that the gods began to understand the war as a test not only of strength, but of restraint. Direct confrontation had proven costly. Each divine descent into the world destabilized the laws the gods themselves were trying to preserve. When a god manifested fully, reality bent under the weight of presence alone. Mountains buckled. Magic surged unpredictably. Even victories carried devastation. Gradually, the gods reduced their direct intervention, acting instead through shaped forces, layered laws, and delegated will. This decision altered the rhythm of the war. The primordials, bound to neither restraint nor foresight, continued to strike with overwhelming force. But where once the gods answered blow for blow, they now responded asymmetrically. A volcanic assault might be countered not by quenching fire, but by rewriting the conditions under which magma could rise. A tidal annihilation might be blunted not by divine opposition, but by anchoring coastlines more deeply into Tyrell's metaphysical structure. These were not spectacular victories. They were quiet ones, and they endured. A subtle but decisive development followed. The gods began embedding their authority into the world itself. Natural cycles, seasons, fertility, decay, and renewal were formalized not merely as phenomena, but as systems that resisted sudden, total disruption. Chontea's influence over growth ensured that life returned even after catastrophic loss. Saloon's light imposed navigational constancy upon sky and sea. Maestra's weave stabilized magic, preventing it from collapsing into raw elemental discharge. Each system limited the primordial's ability to reset the world to chaos. The primordials reacted with increasing fury. Unable to unmake these systems without prolonged effort, they escalated their assaults on scale. Entire regions were targeted for complete erasure. The intent was no longer to reclaim dominion, but to demonstrate that nothing the gods built could be protected everywhere at once. This shift forced the gods into difficult choices. They could not defend all places simultaneously. Some regions were abandoned, sacrificed to preserve others. These losses hardened divine resolve and reshaped divine ethics. Preservation became selective. Survival became strategic. It was during these grim calculations that the role of Ao, the overgod, became increasingly apparent, not as an intervening force, but as a boundary. Though absent from the battlefield, Ao's imposed limitations on divine action constrained how far the gods could escalate. They could bend reality. They could not break it entirely. This unseen constraint prevented the conflict from dissolving the structure of existence outright. Many gods resented this limitation. Yet without it, the war would have ended not with victory, but with annihilation. A critical turning point came when the gods succeeded in permanently binding one of the most destructive primordials beneath Tyrell's surface. This binding was not achieved through brute force, but through layered law, divine edicts woven into geography, time, and magic simultaneously. The primordial was imprisoned in a state of suspended consequence, neither fully aware nor fully dormant. The effect was immediate and far-reaching. Elemental assaults across Tyrell weakened, regions stabilized. For the first time since the war began, there were places where creation outpaced destruction. The gods recognized this not as a singular triumph, but as proof of concept. Binding worked, if done carefully, collectively, and at immense cost. The primordials understood this as well. For beings that had never known confinement, the idea of permanent limitation was intolerable. Their retaliation was swift and coordinated in a way previously unseen. Multiple primordials struck simultaneously across Tyrell, targeting the very systems that enabled binding. Magic was flooded with instability. Seasons faltered. Growth withered in key regions. The gods' embedded authority was challenged directly, not by force alone, but by sustained corruption. The world held, but barely. By the end of this phase, the nature of the Dawn War had transformed yet again. It was no longer about dominance, nor even survival alone. It had become a contest over permanence. Could anything endure forever? Could chaos be constrained indefinitely? Could gods impose limits without becoming tyrants over reality itself? The answers were no longer theoretical. They were being written into the bedrock of Tyrell, and every choice made in this crucible would echo into every age that followed. As the consequences of binding became undeniable, the Dawn War entered its most dangerous phase, not because the fighting intensified, but because the nature of victory itself changed. The gods had proven that primordials could be contained. What they had not yet proven was whether containment could last. Binding a primordial was not an end. It was a commitment. Every imprisoned elemental force required constant reinforcement. Divine law had to be maintained, magical structures sustained, and the surrounding regions stabilized against inevitable backlash. The gods learned that every prison was also a wound, one that demanded vigilance. Neglect did not result in quiet failure. It resulted in catastrophe. This realization forced the gods to make a decision that would permanently alter the future of Faerûn. They could no longer shoulder this burden alone. Until now, divine creations had been tools, dragons, giants, and lesser servitors designed for specific functions. In this stage of the war, the gods began shaping beings with continuity, memory, and inheritance, not merely to fight, but to endure. These creations were intended to persist after the war, to maintain the structures the gods embedded into the world. This was the first true step toward a world that could survive divine absence. Giants were empowered as wardens of land and stone, bound closely to the physical world and the prisons buried within it. Their strength was not only martial, but custodial. Many were tasked, knowingly or not, with dwelling near sites of primordial containment, their societies forming around places where the world remained unstable. Dragons, by contrast, were shaped with greater independence. Their elemental nature allowed them to sense fluctuations in magic and matter, making them both weapons and sentinels. Some guarded sites of great power, others were drawn to them instinctively. In time, this would foster greed, rivalry, and hoarding behavior, but during the Dawn War, it served a purpose. These choices carried a hidden cost. By granting such beings autonomy and longevity, the gods created heirs to the war's consequences without granting them the war's context. Dragons and giants inherited fragments of divine intent, but not divine restraint. As the war dragged on, their rivalries intensified, each claiming legitimacy as the rightful inheritors of a reshaped world. Meanwhile, the primordials adapted in a manner that unsettled even the gods. Unable to prevent binding directly, they began corrupting the mechanisms of containment. Elemental influence seeped into magic, twisting it subtly rather than overwhelming it. Regions that appeared stable began producing unpredictable surges, arcane anomalies that hinted at pressure building beneath the surface. This was not brute force. It was erosion. A crucial moment came when a major containment site partially failed. The primordial did not escape fully, but its awareness returned. The result was not immediate destruction, but a sustained distortion of the surrounding world. Seasons no longer aligned. Creatures born nearby exhibited elemental instability. Magic behaved inconsistently, sometimes obeying divine law, sometimes ignoring it entirely. The gods recognized this as a warning. Binding was not binary. It could weaken. This revelation forced a shift in long-term strategy. The goal was no longer to imprison every primordial indefinitely, but to reduce their influence to a level where the world could absorb it. Absolute order was neither achievable nor desirable. A controlled imbalance, carefully distributed, became the new objective. In pursuing this balance, the gods formalized their roles more clearly than ever before. Portfolios crystallized under pressure. Deities of war, magic, life, death, and nature emerged not as abstractions, but as necessary functions within a strained system. Divine identity hardened, and with it, divine limitation. The primordials sensed the narrowing of possibility. Their assaults grew desperate, less coordinated, more violent. Some attempted self-destruction rather than containment, tearing themselves apart to destabilize the prisons forming around them. These acts reshaped entire regions of Toril, creating places where elemental influence would remain dangerously high for all future ages. By the end of this stage, the outcome of the Dawn War was no longer uncertain, but it was no longer clean. The gods were winning, but they were winning a world that would never again be simple, stable, or free of ancient pressure. They had preserved reality, but in doing so, they had embedded conflict into its foundation. Toril would endure, and it would remember. By this point in the Dawn War, victory had become a matter of attrition rather than conquest. The primordials still possessed immense power, but their freedom of action had narrowed. Each binding, each layered law woven into Toril reduced the range in which elemental chaos could act without resistance. The war was no longer decided by singular cataclysms, but by whether the gods could maintain coherence over time. This was when hierarchy emerged among the gods, not as tyranny, but as coordination under strain. Some deities proved more capable of sustaining long-term pressure. Others exhausted themselves quickly when forced into constant reinforcement. Authority began to flow toward those whose portfolios aligned with stability, continuity, and regulation. This shift was subtle, but irreversible. Divine equality gave way to functional leadership. It was during this phase that the gods refined the concept of delegated power. Rather than concentrating divine presence at sites of containment, they distributed influence across systems that could operate independently. Natural laws were reinforced so that they required minimal intervention once established. Magic, once volatile, became predictable within defined limits. Death itself was formalized as a boundary rather than a failure of creation. These changes reduced the gods' immediate burden, but increased the long-term rigidity of the world. The primordials responded by targeting what they now understood to be the gods' greatest vulnerability: dependency. If divine systems required continuity, then disruption, even briefly, could cascade catastrophically. Elemental forces began striking not at prisons, but at the spaces between them. Ley lines warped, magical currents surged. Regions far from any containment site began to destabilize, seemingly without cause. This strategy nearly succeeded. Several divine systems faltered simultaneously, creating conditions where Toril's structure wavered. Gravity weakened in isolated regions. Time slipped out of alignment. in rare places, cause no longer reliably followed effect. These phenomena were not localized disasters. They were warnings that the world itself could fracture if stressed beyond a critical threshold. In response, the gods made one of their most consequential decisions of the war. They accepted permanent limitation on their own interference. Rather than risk catastrophic overlap of divine actions, the gods formalized constraints on manifestation and direct alteration of reality. Power would still flow, but through defined channels. Intervention would require alignment with established law. This decision did not end divine conflict, but it prevented escalation from collapsing existence outright. The impact was immediate. Elemental incursions became harder to sustain. Primordial influence could still surge, but it encountered resistance embedded everywhere rather than opposition concentrated in a few places. The world itself began to reject prolonged chaos. At the same time, this limitation created distance between gods and the world they had saved. They were no longer omnipresent actors within Toril, but overseers bound by the systems they had constructed. Authority endured, but intimacy diminished. During this period, the primordials began to fall in earnest. Not all were slain, many could not be, but more were bound, fragmented, or driven so deeply into dormancy that their influence faded to whispers. Each defeat reshaped the balance further, making subsequent victories less costly. The war's center of gravity shifted. What had once been an existential struggle now resembled a slow sealing of fractures. The gods focused less on triumph and more on consolidation. The primordials, diminished but defiant, lashed out where they could, leaving behind regions of persistent instability, echoes of a power that refused to vanish quietly. By the close of this stage, the outcome was effectively decided. Chaos had not been eradicated, but it had been contained to depths and distances that could no longer threaten reality as a whole. Order had not conquered, but it had endured. Yet the cost of this endurance was becoming clear. The world the gods had preserved was now layered with constraints, responsibilities, and latent dangers. It would require stewardship. It would require successors. And it would require acceptance that the age of direct divine warfare was ending. Not because peace had been achieved, but because reality could no longer survive another such conflict. The Dawn War was drawing toward its conclusion, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. As the Dawn War neared its end, the nature of defeat became clearer than the nature of victory. The primordials were not being erased from existence. They were being removed from relevance. Bound beneath continents, scattered across the elemental chaos, or reduced to dormant remnants, their ability to shape reality on a cosmic scale was broken. What remained of them persisted as pressure rather than presence. This distinction mattered. The gods understood now that destruction was not required for resolution. What mattered was control of consequence. A primordial that could no longer act meaningfully was, for all practical purposes, defeated. This realization spared reality from further catastrophic escalation, but it also ensured that the war's end would be incomplete by design. One of the most decisive developments of this phase was the stabilization of Toril's deep structure. The gods reinforced the separation between the world and the elemental chaos, preventing large-scale bleed-through. Where once elemental power had surged freely into the material realm, it now encountered resistance shaped into the world's metaphysical foundation. This did not eliminate elemental influence, but it constrained it to predictable patterns. Volcanoes erupted where fire was permitted to rise. Earth shifted where stone was allowed to move. Storms formed where sky and sea could still argue. Chaos survived, but under supervision. The primordials experienced this not as imprisonment alone, but as humiliation. Their power still existed, but it could no longer define the world. Some lapsed into dormancy, their awareness fading as centuries passed without meaningful expression. Others resisted endlessly, their rage diffusing into the land itself. These would become the sources of persistent instability, regions of wild magic, unnatural terrain, and elemental corruption that would plague later ages. The gods, in turn, confronted a different challenge: succession. The systems they had created could endure, but only if maintained. The gods could not remain locked in perpetual vigilance without undermining the very limitations they had imposed on themselves. A world dependent on constant divine correction was a world one crisis away from collapse. The solution was gradual withdrawal. Divine presence receded from direct governance and embedded itself instead in institutions of reality. Natural cycles continued without oversight. Magic flowed through the weave without constant correction. Life and death followed defined paths that no longer required divine arbitration at every step. The world began to function on its own terms for the first time. This withdrawal did not mean abandonment. It meant trust. During this transition, dragons and giants reached the height of their influence. With the gods stepping back, these ancient beings filled the vacuum, interpreting their inherited authority as ownership. Giants claimed dominion over land and stone. Dragons claimed dominion over power itself. Their conflicts were not remnants of the Dawn War, but distortions of it, echoes without context. Mortals, still fragile and few, existed on the margins of these struggles, yet they endured. In places where divine law held firm and elemental influence was muted, life stabilized. Growth outpaced destruction. Memory accumulated. Culture became possible. This was the quiet success of the gods' long strategy. A final, sobering truth emerged as the war truly ended. The Dawn War had not forged a perfect world. It had forged a survivable one. The gods accepted this outcome not with triumph, but with restraint. They had preserved reality at the cost of certainty, simplicity, and direct control. Toril stood, scarred, constrained, and alive. The primordials were diminished, but not gone. The gods were victorious, but limited, and the future, no longer dictated by cosmic war, was left open to beings who had not yet learned how dangerous freedom could be. The age that followed would not remember the Dawn War clearly, but it would live inside its consequences every day. With the great struggles ended, the silence that followed the Dawn War was not peace, but recalibration. The cosmos did not relax. It settled. Forces that had been strained to their limits began to assume stable positions, like stone cooling after a furnace. For the first time since creation began to resist itself, reality no longer shook under constant correction. Toril entered an age defined not by battle, but by inheritance. The gods, bound by the limits they had accepted, no longer shaped the world through sweeping acts of will. Instead, they governed through distance, influence rather than imposition. Divine attention turned inward, toward the maintenance of cosmic balance rather than the correction of every flaw. What they had built was now expected to function without constant intervention. This withdrawal exposed a truth that had been obscured by war. The world was no longer primarily divine. In the absence of continual godly presence, the legacies of the Dawn War asserted themselves. The prisons that bound primordials remained intact, but they were not inert. Pressure accumulated. Elemental influence seeped outward in subtle, persistent ways. These influences did not announce themselves with cataclysm, but with distortion. Regions where magic behaved strangely, where land resisted cultivation, where storms returned to the same places with unnatural regularity. These were not failures of design. They were compromises made permanent. Dragons and giants, unchallenged by divine authority, interpreted the stability of the world as validation of their dominion. Giants built vast empires upon the bones of the land, unaware or uninterested that their realms were often centered on sites of ancient containment. Dragons, drawn to power both arcane and elemental, claimed places where the scars of the war still bled latent energy. Their hoards were not merely wealth, they were anchors. This concentration of power had consequences. Where giants imposed order through strength and lineage, dragons embodied continuity through possession and memory. Both believed themselves rightful stewards of the world's most dangerous places. Their inevitable conflict was not born of malice, but of incompatible interpretations of inheritance. Each war between them disturbed the deep balances the gods had so carefully constructed. Mortals emerged into this tension quietly. They were not created as weapons, nor as wardens. They arose as survivors. In regions where divine law was strong and elemental pressure low, fragile life took hold. Mortals learned to adapt not through power, but through resilience. They multiplied where giants ruled loosely and dragons slept deeply. They endured where greater beings could not be bothered to notice them. This endurance marked a shift no god had fully predicted. Unlike dragons or giants, mortals did not inherit the Dawn War's grudges. They inherited its world. They learned its rhythms without memory of the cost at which those rhythms were purchased. To them, seasons were natural. Magic was mysterious, but consistent. Mountains existed because they always had. Ignorance became stability. The gods observed this development with caution. Mortals were unpredictable, short-lived, and inventive in ways that defied divine categorization. They exploited gaps in systems designed for immortals. They worshipped selectively. They questioned. In time, they would reshape the gods as much as the gods shaped them. Yet for now, mortals served an unintended purpose: diffusion. By spreading across the world, mortals redistributed attention, belief, and influence. No single site of power remained uncontested forever. No prison remained entirely isolated. Through settlement, agriculture, and eventually civilization, mortals stabilized regions long prone to fluctuation. Not through force, but through presence. The lingering primordials felt this encroachment keenly. Their influence persisted, but it was diluted. Where once they had contested gods, they now contested erosion, of memory, of dominance, of relevance. Their power endured in deep places, but the surface world moved on without them. This, more than binding, marked their true defeat. The Dawn War had shaped reality by necessity. What followed reshaped it by habit. Systems became traditions. Laws became assumptions. The extraordinary faded into the background of existence. And yet, nothing was erased. Every mountain raised in war still bore the tension of its origin. Every sea carved by catastrophe remembered its depth. Magic flowed smoothly, but it flowed along channels cut by conflict. The gods ruled, but they ruled a world that no longer required constant proof of their power. The war that had defined existence receded into myth, not because it was forgotten, but because it was no longer questioned. Reality endured, and in enduring, it concealed the truth that it had once nearly failed to exist at all. Time, once a fragile concept defended by divine effort, now moved forward without supervision. Ages accumulated quietly, layering history atop consequence. The Dawn War faded from living memory, not through denial, but through distance. What had once demanded gods and primordials to contend over every law of existence became the unquestioned backdrop of the world. This forgetting was not accidental. It was structural. The gods understood that memory itself could destabilize what they had preserved. A world constantly aware of how close it had come to unmaking would never truly settle. And so, without decree or erasure, the knowledge of the Dawn War receded into fragments. Myths, contradictions, half-remembered truths preserved by immortals and scholars, but inaccessible to common understanding. Yet the war never truly ended. It transformed. The prisons of the primordials endured, but time altered their nature. Binding weakened not through failure, but through erosion. Divine law remained intact, yet the constant pressure of elemental existence found subtle expressions. In deep places, far from the sun and the reach of settled lands, the influence of the primordials persisted as distortion rather than domination. Earth remembered being a weapon. Fire remembered being unbound. Water remembered the freedom to consume without limit. These memories expressed themselves not as rebellion, but as anomaly. Mountains that moved imperceptibly over centuries, caverns where stone flowed like liquid, seas that swallowed coastlines in rhythms older than any calendar. Magic surged unpredictably in regions where elemental influence pressed too closely against the world's skin. To later ages, these places would be known as cursed, wild, or forbidden. They were none of these. They were unfinished. Dragons and giants, long past their zenith, felt these pressures more keenly than mortals. Their longevity allowed them to sense imbalance accumulating slowly. Some dragons withdrew deeper into isolation, hoarding not only treasure but distance from change. Others sought to control sites of instability, believing that proximity to primordial influence affirmed their ancient purpose. Giants fractured under similar strain. Their civilizations, once aligned with the land's custodial needs, struggled to adapt to a world no longer defined by war. Some clung to inherited authority. Others diminished, their role no longer clear in a reality that functioned without them. Mortals, however, adapted without reverence. They built atop scars without knowing they were scars. Cities rose over fault lines of ancient power. Roads crossed places where gods and primordials had once collided. Mortals did not seek balance. They sought survival, prosperity, meaning. And in doing so, they unintentionally stabilized regions the gods themselves had once struggled to maintain. Belief became a new kind of force. As mortals worshipped, questioned, and reinterpreted the gods, divine power shifted subtly. Portfolios adjusted, influence redistributed. The gods did not lose authority, but they gained dependence. Mortal belief anchored them to the world in ways the Dawn War never had. Divinity became relational rather than absolute. This was not foreseen. The gods had saved reality from chaos, but in doing so, they had created a world capable of reshaping them in return. Worship refined divine identity. Neglect diminished it. The pantheon evolved, not through conquest, but through relevance. The lingering primordials perceived this change dimly. Their power had never depended on belief. They existed regardless of recognition. But this strength became weakness. In a world shaped increasingly by thought, culture, and interpretation, beings defined purely by elemental impulse found fewer avenues of expression. They endured, but they stagnated. The final truth of the Dawn War emerged only with the passage of long ages. Reality had not been won by order over chaos, nor by gods over primordials. It had been won by limitation, by acceptance of constraint, by the willingness to trade perfection for persistence. The gods had chosen a world that could endure without them. That choice defined everything that followed. Every age of Faerun, its triumphs, its disasters, its forgotten empires, unfolded atop foundations laid not in peace, but in compromise. The war that shaped reality itself did not end with celebration. It ended with withdrawal, silence, and the slow normalization of survival. The final echoes of that war were no longer found in the heavens or the depths. They were found in the simple fact that the world continued to exist. When the last echoes of the Dawn War finally settled into the fabric of existence, there was no moment that could be named as its ending. No final battle, no universal proclamation. The war concluded the only way it could, by becoming irrelevant to the day-to-day survival of reality. That was its true resolution. The gods remained, but no longer as architects standing over an unfinished work. They became custodians of a structure already set, constrained by laws they themselves had woven under unbearable pressure. Their power endured, yet it was bounded, channeled through portfolios, mediated by belief, and limited by the very order that had allowed existence to survive. Divinity was no longer infinite expression. It was responsibility. The primordials endured as well, but only as remnants of a former totality. Their presence lingered in Taril's deepest places, in elemental nexuses and impossible landscapes where the world still remembered what it had once been. They were not defeated in the mortal sense. They were rendered obsolete. A universe governed by consequence, continuity, and memory no longer had a place for beings defined solely by impulse. What remained was a world balanced on constraint. Faerûn emerged not as a pristine creation, but as a layered one, its mountains raised by force, its seas carved by catastrophe, its magic stabilized through sacrifice. Every fundamental system mortals would later take for granted existed because it had once failed and been rebuilt under fire. Gravity held because it had nearly broken. Magic flowed because it had once torn reality apart. Life endured because the gods learned when not to intervene. This inheritance shaped everything that followed. Later, divine conflicts, mortal cataclysms, fallen empires, and reshaped pantheons all unfolded within boundaries established during the Dawn War. Even moments that seemed to threaten existence itself never truly approached the same precipice, because reality now resisted absolute collapse. It had learned, in its earliest agony, how to endure. The most enduring legacy of the war was not destruction, but limitation. The gods could not unmake the world without unmaking themselves. The primordials could not reclaim dominance without tearing apart the stage on which they existed. Mortals, fragile and transient, inherited a reality sturdy enough to outlast them and flexible enough to change. That paradox defined Faerûn more than any divine decree. The war that shaped reality itself did not create heroes or villains in the way later ages would understand them. It created boundaries. It defined what could exist, how power could be used, and what prices could no longer be paid. Existence survived not because it was perfect, but because it accepted imperfection as a condition of continuation. And so the Dawn War passed into myth, not because it was forgotten, but because its outcome became invisible. Every sunrise that followed, every season that turned, every spell that functioned as intended, testified to its conclusion more clearly than any chronicle. Reality held. That was the victory.